But first, this is now beyond left or right. The Victorian Labor government has got to be cut out like a cancer in the election on Saturday week. It's not just that this is one of the most incompetent state governments we have seen. It is also, without doubt, one of the most politically corrupt. Today, two more disturbing, even shocking developments on both the incompetence and the political corruption. A corruption was further exposed in secret recordings with a man, the so-called preference whisperer Glenn Drury, boasting how his pay to stitch up preference deals to elect politicians who generally back the Andrews government. Deals that essentially hijack votes in ways that most voters would never realise.
We've got to give the government, which will be the Andrews government, we've got to give them a crossbench they can work with.
But let's first deal quickly with the less dramatic, but perhaps the most important of today's developments before we get to the political corruption that could then save Premier Daniel Andrews from the consequences. That's how it works. Andrews is spending so wildly that in a couple of years, Victoria's debt is projected to be bigger than the New South Wales one, the Queensland one, and Tasmania's combined. Now, it's not just that this government can't stop spending on election bribes. For instance, it's now promising even free tampons for everyone to win the women's vote. More dangerous are its mad schemes like its promised rail loop around Melbourne, linking outer suburbs to other outer suburbs that no one wants to go to either. Premier Andrews claims that this would cost $50 billion. An independent government audit says no, it's already blowing out to $125 billion, which would make it the biggest loss maker in the state's history, or perhaps of any state. And today, the international ratings agency Standard & Poor's, it issued a brutal warning. It said Victoria's fiscal position over the last few years has been the weakest that Standard & Poor's has seen, and we have been dealing with the state since the 1980s. That is a warning. But if you're a Victorian thinking, well, gosh, this is so warning, and by the way, you know, Andrews' brutal lockdowns, what was that all about? I've got to vote against Dan Andrews. Today we learn that your vote could actually be secretly hijacked to elect politicians who actually support Andrews. Now, this Labor government is already the focus of 5 investigations or inquiries by the state's anti-corruption body. It could now face a 6th. And that's because Victoria still has what every single state has banned, apart from Victoria, a system of voting in the upper house where if you vote above the line, only your first vote counts. And many voters would not know that. They will vote like they can in federal elections, for instance, numbering boxes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, in the order of their preferences. Now, in fact, more than 90% of voters in Victoria vote above the line, but the state laws say only that first vote counts. Now, what few voters in Victoria would know is that once they do vote 1 above the line, the preferences after that, even if they go on 2, 3, 4, 5, the preferences after that have already been worked out in the back rooms by the political parties. So that if one minor party doesn't get elected, their preferences go on to the next, and so on until someone gets enough to get elected. And just who, you would never guess. And working out these little sneaky deals has become a huge business opportunity for a man called Glenn Drury. He's infamous as the preference whisperer. He charges parties $5,000 just for helping them make these deals, federally as well, by the way, and he charges $55,000 when they win. And not just that. Some of his grateful clients, like the Justice Party of Darren Hinch, like Victoria's Liberal Democrats too, they've also given him a taxpayer-funded job in their offices. His success, taxpayers must pay. Drury says that he got 9 politicians elected into Victoria's upper house last election, where they hold the balance of power, and 2 were critical supporters of Dan Andrews' lockdown laws. So this really matters. But 2 new candidates in this election, former soldiers Heston Russell and Chris Burson of the New Angry Victorians Party, have now released a video of this preference whisperer boasting of what he can do for them as well, boasting from the yacht that he lives in Sydney, what he can do by exploiting Victoria's notorious group voting ticket rules.
Victoria's the only state that hasn't changed it.
Well, I won't go into private conversations, but suffice to say, let's say you're the government. You need to govern. You don't like the Greens. You join the dots, right? I caused 4 Greens to lose their seats last time.
Yeah, right.
4 of the suckers. So now the Labor Party was very happy with that. They could govern. I'm not talking about from a policy perspective. I don't get into that.
Yeah, no wonder Labor's very happy with it. But here is an example, a very specific example of this rot and why it is so poisonous for democracy. I mentioned this new Sack Dan Andrews Party. Catchy title. It's actually a con. It's a front. It's meant to siphon votes away from real parties that are against Daniel Andrews, like One Nation, Clive Palmer's party, the Anti-Lockdown Freedom Party, and then distribute the preferences to someone else who's not against Daniel Andrews. Glenn Drury admits it.
I'll tell you about Sack Dan Andrews, and I'm bringing you into confidence here. It's one of mine. That's been formed because if that gets a decent draw, it's going to completely usurp Clive, One Nation, and poor little Aiden.
Premier Andrews today suggested this dirty work had nothing to do with him.
I don't believe I've ever met him, and preferences are dealt with by the party.
Yeah, Andrews is a control freak, but you're supposed to believe he knew nothing about such preference deals under a rotten system that only Victoria hasn't banned, a system that the Premier still won't promise to scrap.
Why hasn't the government actually taken any action on this?
Well, we are very much focused on delivering on the commitments that we made in 14, in 18, and rolling out an equally positive and optimistic plan in the 2022 election. We've made very substantial reform in areas like mental health and family violence. So we have many different reform priorities, and we'll wait and see what the Electoral Matters Committee finds.
And then again today, we've got that typical Daniel Andrews stonewalling, refusing to answer questions about what seems to me a clear example of more political corruption in Australia's most corrupt state.
Well, I'm going to wait and see. I'm going to wait, and we'll wait and see, and I'm going to wait and see. I'm going to wait and see. And let's also wait and see, and I wait and see, because then I'm going to wait and see.
There is something very rotten about the Victorian Labor government. It's so rotten that even voters now who've had a gutful and think they're voting against it will actually be tricked into voting to keep it. Victorians, vote wisely next week because this government must go.